In this video, I'm going to be showing you Zeet, which is a platform engineering tool that I like to use for rapidly developing Kubernetes applications. In this walkthrough tutorial, I'll show you how easy it is to provision a new Kubernetes cluster, how to deploy a Kubernetes application to it, as well as how to deploy third-party Helm charts to that Kubernetes cluster. We'll start off by provisioning an EKS cluster using Zeet, but if costs are a concern to you, I'll also be showing you how you can hook Zeet up to a Minikube cluster so you can deploy to that instead. All the code that I use in this video is available in the description below, so make sure to go grab it and fork those repositories to your own so you can use it for your own Zeet deployments. This video also includes chapters, so make sure to click around to the sections that are applicable to your needs. By the way, this video is sponsored by Zeet, but all the opinions I express in it are of my own. I do have a sponsored link in the description. If you want to use that, it does help me out. Otherwise, just head on over to zeet.co, create an account, and link your AWS account, and you'll be ready to get started. Hey there, so let's go ahead and get started. So I'm logged on to Zeet, and the one thing that you need to do before you get started with any of these tutorials is you'll need to go under Clouds and just make sure that your AWS account is authorized. It's pretty simple to do. You basically just add the account and you'll log on to AWS, and it's going to do a CloudFormation template and everything will be set up for you. Once everything's set up, you should get this connected check mark and then you're ready to go. The next thing we need to do is we need to link a Kubernetes cluster into Zeet. So if you head under clusters, this is where you could either provision a new Kubernetes cluster or you could add a Kubernetes cluster. So to get started, you would just hit click here to connect a cluster. And since I have my Amazon account connected, it gives me the option to create a Kubernetes cluster, or I could upload a kubeconfig file and connect an already provisioned Kubernetes cluster. Now, if I were to create a cluster here, it's as easy as that. However, EKS clusters are very expensive. Now, if you're on a development team that has a budget for an EKS cluster, this is a very good option. But for most of us, EKS clusters are sort of out of budget and we want to use something like Minikube. So I'm going to show you how you can create a Minikube cluster and connect it to Zeet. But I'm going to save creating the Minikube cluster until later in the tutorial, as getting it externally accessible is a little bit more involved. For now, I'm going to show you deploying applications and Helm charts to our EKS cluster as soon as it's done provisioning, which will probably take 5 or 10 minutes. So I'm just going to speed up the video and meet back with you guys here. Alright, so Zeet has provisioned our EKS cluster for us. Now, if we want to deploy an application to it, all we have to do is go to deploy here. And then I want to deploy an application using my GitHub repository. So I'll just click here. And I have this Zeet Flask repository that you guys can use as well. So just go ahead and fork this repository and you can use it as well. And just to have a quick look at this, you can see that it's a very simple Flask application. I only have this main.py file and requirements.txt in it. And basically, it's just a Flask server that replies deployed with Zeet. So we're going to go ahead and deploy this using Zeet. So we'll go deploy. And we want to use Docker run on Kubernetes. So we'll go ahead and click that. And here you can see it gives the cost estimate. So this is based on EKS pricing, which is pretty expensive. Again, at the end of this video, I'm going to show you how you can use Zeet with your Minikube cluster so you don't have to incur such high costs. I'm going to lower this to less cores, as our application doesn't require a dedicated core. A shared core environment is fine with me. And I'll just hit continue. And I will hit deploy now. And so now Zeet's going through the steps of deploying to our Kubernetes cluster. You can see that it's doing build and it just switched over to deploy pending, container pulling. It's actually going quite quickly here before I can even explain anything. But basically what I'm trying to say here is to get an application onto Kubernetes, the application has to go through quite a few steps, right? We started with a Python file there wasn't even a Docker file in that repository. What Zeet is doing is it's pulling that Python file, it's creating a Docker file for it, it's creating it into a container image, and then uploading that to an ECR container repository, and then the EKS Kubernetes cluster is going to pull down that container and deploy it to the Kubernetes cluster, and we should be able to curl that application. So our application is deployed, and we got a pop-up saying congratulations, our project is successfully deployed. So I will go through here, and now you can see we're in the interface that shows everything. So I have my runtime logs. Basically, this is everything that's happening to the application. We have the deployments tab, so this was the first time it was deployed, but if we made any changes, the changes would come up here. Let's go ahead and see if we can access this application. And we just click the button, and it says deploy with Zeet. So there it is. That's how easy it was to get the application onto Zeet. I don't like that it says deploy with Zeet, so I'm going to make a modification to my source code and then watch Zeet deploy that to my Kubernetes cluster. So if I go back into my source code, main.py, I'll say deployed with Zeet and hit commit changes. And that should be enough to trigger the next Zeet build. So let's head on back into Zeet. And I'm not sure if the interface refreshes by itself, so I'll just refresh here. And you can see it already picked up the change, and it's building the new container image. So we'll just give this a minute to go through here. And I'm just going to click around. And there, we can see that the first one was deployed. Now it's deploying the second version. All right, so I sped up the video a little bit here, but you can see that it only took about a minute to deploy our application. So it stopped the old version and the new version is deployed. Now, if we go back to overview and click the endpoint, you can see that it is fixed. It now says deployed with Zeet. So that's how quickly it is to make changes to your source code and have them appear in your Kubernetes cluster. Now let's look at how we can deploy something like a Helm chart to deploy an application like Argo CD. So I'm going to go up to create new, and I will say deploy a Helm chart. And it asks me for two different things here. It's asking me for the Helm repository and the Helm chart. And in Artifact Hub, I've searched for Jenkins, and this looks like the official Jenkins repository. So I'm just going to go under install, and I'm going to take in the repository name, put it right here, and then I'm going to take the chart name, copy that in, and paste it in there. And you can see Zeet is able to go out and read that this is Jenkins, and it gives us a nice little description of what this Helm chart is. So I'll just hit continue. And now we get the options to make any sort of customizations to this Helm chart, such as the namespace or any custom values that you want. I'm going to change the namespace to build servers and just hit continue. And then the very last option is you can choose which cluster to deploy it to. I only have the one EKS cluster configured here, but if you had multiple Kubernetes clusters, you would have the option to choose which cluster you're deploying to. So I'm just going to hit deploy now. And it should go through and deploy Jenkins using this Helm chart. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video for when this completes. All right, so that actually deployed quite quickly here. It only took about 30 seconds, and now we have Jenkins deployed to our EKS cluster. And if we hopped into the EKS cluster, we could connect to Jenkins and start using it. That's sort of out of scope of this tutorial. What I want to show you next is how we can deploy Terraform infrastructure using Zeet. And I'm going to be deploying AWS Lightsail server that hosts a Minikube cluster that you guys could also use for your development environment. So to get started with that, I'm just going to go create new and hit Terraform. And again, I'm presented with my repositories that I have shared to Zeet. And I'm going to choose my Zeet Minikube and just hit deploy here. make sure my AWS account is selected, and then hit deploy now, and then deploy now. And basically what this is doing is it's running the Terraform up command on that Terraform file that I've provided in this repository. And you can see the output looks exactly like a Terraform up command. The benefit that Zeet is actually providing us is it's doing all the state management for us. So if you're working with a team in Terraform, you need a state management strategy. And usually this requires you creating like an S3 bucket and making sure your Terraform can talk to that S3 bucket and save the files. Basically, Zeet is taking out that complexity to you. So all you have to do is point to a repository and Zeet takes care of the rest. Now, just to verify that Zeet has created my infrastructure, I'm going to go over to my Amazon Lightsail, and you can see that it has provisioned a Minikube cluster. It's still pending, so it's still coming up. That's sort of on the Amazon side, but it will take a few minutes to actually complete here, and then we'll connect to it. Now, for those of you that are interested what this Terraform file contains, I'll go through it quickly here. And basically, it's a simple repository containing this main.tf file that sets up an AWS Lightsail instance. And basically what AWS Lightsail is, it's a low-cost instance on AWS. I think the lowest tier is about $3.50 per month. And it's really like a simplified EC2 instance. You don't have to worry about like VPCs or security groups. It's a lot more simplified. So it's really good for like these small development environments where you just want sort of like Minikube installed so you can mess around. So it's provisioning that server. The next thing it does is it opens up ports. So open up SSH port 80 and then 8001. And this is where our Kubernetes management traffic is going to come into. So that's an important port to open here. And then this userdata.sh, basically this is a shell script that gets run when the instance is provisioned. And that's in my repository as well. And you can see exactly what I did here. I'm installing Minikube, installing kubectl, installing Docker, and then starting Minikube. But at the very bottom is the most important part of this configuration, and it's sort of set up in two different sections here. The first one is it's creating an external service account and binding a role to it. And this is the service account that your external users are going to use. So Zeet, for example. The next thing is it sets up a token for this external account and then makes this external kubeconfig file and just makes all the settings of that kubeconfig file settings that you would need to access this Minikube cluster externally. So once our AWS Lightsail instance finished provisioning, we're going to hop into it and then we'll grab this file. And you could actually download this to your own workstation and connect up to your Minikube externally, as well as you can provide it to Zeet, and Zeet will be able to connect up to that Minikube cluster. Let's head back to Zeet. And at the very bottom here, you can see I have an output that outputs the outside IP address of the instance. So I'm going to grab that. And I'm going to SSH into the IP address. I had Jenkins in my clipboard. Hit yes. And I actually created a start.log. So I actually need this to complete before I can grab that kubectl config. And just to give you some more visibility of what's happening here is basically in this start.shell script, you can see I'm echoing to the start.log file. So once it says start script complete, that's when I'll be ready to grab the external kubeconfig file. So I'll do a tail F start and just come back when it's complete. All right, so my instance has finished provisioning. So I'm going to cat out this external kubeconfig file. And this is exactly what it looks like. Basically, it just took the default Minikube kubeconfig file that gets created when you provision a Minikube cluster, but it changed this server parameter to be the outside IP address and then port 8001. And then it's using a username and password to access it instead of client certificates that are local to the machine. So I'm going to grab this and copy it and save it to a file locally, and then I'm going to upload that file to Zeet. Now, there's actually one more thing we need to do before we upload this external kubeconfig file to Zeet, and that's to forward management traffic to Kubernetes. So in my Minikube repository, if we grab this kubecontrol proxy command, basically what this is saying is listen on all IP addresses and accept all hosts, and it's going to proxy the traffic to port 8001 by default. So if I do this, it's now listening on port 8001. So now if I go into Zeet and go to clusters, manage clusters, and hit upload kubeconfig.yaml file and select the kubeconfig file that I saved, you can see that it is able to see my Minikube cluster. Now, if you're following along with this tutorial and you're getting a red X, it's probably one of two things. It's either going to be you didn't do that kubecontrol proxy command to forward traffic to port 8001. It might be that you changed one of the settings in Lightsail under networking to not listen on port 8001. Or it's going to be with that external kubeconfig file that you uploaded. Maybe it's one for an old instance. Just verify that it's the correct file. But now that we have Minikube up, we can deploy to it just like we did with our Kubernetes cluster. So if I just hit deploy and hit create new app, hit GitHub, I can deploy my Flask application to it just the same. I'm going to hit 0 cores, hit continue, and then at the very bottom here, instead of using the EKS cluster, I'm going to deploy to my Minikube cluster. And I've actually hit my limit for the amount of projects I can have on Zeet. You can only have 3 by default, so I'm going to quickly go ahead and remove those, and then I'm going to hit deploy now. All right, so I removed my other projects, so now I should be able to hit deploy now. And it actually wants me to attach a container registry to my Minikube cluster. So this isn't done if you're using a self-managed cluster like we are. So if you actually go to settings and container registries, you can set up something like Docker Hub. You just need to set up a private key to your Docker Hub account and then add it in here. The next thing you would do is go to clusters, go into your self-provisioned cluster, and then you can see here it says configure a container registry for this one. So I'm just going to go docker.io, and I've already added it before, so I'll just select that and hit save. And you can see it's docker.io/DevOpsJourney1/Zeet. Now if I go to deploy, looks like it tried to deploy our application, so I'm just going to go deployments and then restart. And now that I have that registry configured for Minikube, it should be able to deploy our application to it. Now, while this builds, I'm going to go ahead and actually go create new. And let's deploy a Helm chart to this Minikube cluster as well. And then we'll just verify them both. And this time, let's actually deploy Argo CD. So I'm going to search for Argo-CD. And this one looks like the official repository. So I'll hit install, grab this repository name, and then grab this Helm chart name. Hit continue. Namespace, I want it to be Argo CD. Hit continue. And then for my target, I want this to go on my Minikube cluster. So now I'll hit deploy now. And now it is deploying Argo CD to my Minikube cluster, and it looks like it's completed already. So I'm going to go ahead and check out everything that's been provisioned to this Minikube cluster. So if I just head back into my instance and I do a kubecontrol get namespace, you can see that 2 new namespaces were created. The Argo CD namespace was created when we deployed that Helm chart, and I chose to deploy it to the Argo CD namespace. The next thing is this namespace that Zeet created for us by default for our web application. So if I want to see all the resources that were deployed for our web application, we just go kubecontrol get all and specify the namespace. And here you can see that a pod, a service, a deployment, and a replica set was created for this one. And if I wanted to access this application, I could just go into my GitHub repository, and I have this port forward command. I'm going to grab this, paste it in, and I'll actually need to modify it. So I actually just want kube control port forward, the service name, port 3000 to 3000, and then the namespace of this namespace. So I'll put that in, and you can see it's port forwarding. But let's actually do that again and do the ampersand so it sends the port forwarding to the background so I can still interact with my terminal. If I do curl localhost port 3000, you can see that we get deployed with Zeet. So our application was deployed to our Minikube cluster. Let's go ahead and check in on the Argo CD deployment. If we go kube control get all namespace Argo CD, you can see everything that was deployed to Argo CD. And if we wanted to actually access Argo CD, Zeet will give us the instructions for that. Back in Zeet, it tells us all the commands that we would run to actually access Argo CD. So this is the output you would get if you ran any sort of Helm install command. So that's available for you as well. Anyways, I hope this video has been helpful. This video was meant to demonstrate the capabilities that a tool like Zeet provides you. I know that there's a lot more that this platform can do, and everyone's environment is different, so feel free to explore. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below, and I'll try to help you out. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.